The night is long, silent, and utterly still. You can hear your own heartbeat echo against the frozen air. Snow drifts rise like walls outside, swallowing the horizon, and the wind's breath feels alive, whispering stories of people who once lived and fought through the darkness. Welcome to the Viking winter, a world of ice, endurance, and survival. If you have ever wondered how human beings endured months of near-endless night, when the temperature could freeze rivers solid and winds could carve stone, the answer lies not in brute strength but in something far greater: adaptability, unity, and unbreakable spirit. Tonight, we step back in time over 1,000 years to the northern edge of the world, where the Vikings faced nature's most merciless season, winter itself. Imagine standing on a coastal hill in ancient Norway. The fjord below is sealed in ice. The sea, the Vikings' lifeline, has vanished beneath a frozen lid. The sun barely touches the horizon for a few hours each day before retreating again. This is not just cold, it is isolation turned physical, silence turned alive. In this world, survival is not guaranteed. Every decision, from how you build your home to how you share your last piece of bread, could mean the difference between life and death. Yet somehow, these people did not just survive, they thrived. They expanded, traded, sailed to unknown continents, and built a civilization that still fascinates us today. The secret of their endurance begins with a mindset not of conquerors, but of survivors. For the Vikings, winter was not an enemy to fight, but a force to understand. They learned to live with the storm, not against it. Long before the first snow fell, entire families prepared. Like clockwork, firewood was stacked as high as the roof, meat was salted, fish dried, and root vegetables buried in straw-lined pits. Livestock were brought inside the Longhouse not as pets, but as partners in survival. Every cow, goat, and sheep added its warmth to the air, turning the Longhouse into a living furnace of life. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke and the smell of earth. The walls were made of turf and moss, thick enough to hold back the wind. There were no windows, only a small smoke hole that let the fire breathe. It was dark, cramped, and smoky, but it was warm. In the Viking world, warmth was everything. Comfort was not luxury, it was strategy. Still, the greatest battle was not always physical, it was mental. Imagine months without sunlight. The line between day and night blurred until time itself lost meaning. Modern science calls this seasonal affective disorder, but to the Vikings, it was simply the long night. People moved slowly, spoke softly, and huddled close. In the silence, imagination became survival. They told stories, sagas of gods, heroes, and monsters around the fire. These were not just tales to pass the hours. They were psychological armor. Each story reminded them that light always returns, that hardship always has an end. Words became warmth, and myths became medicine. Around the fire, a storyteller's voice could do what no flame could: keep hope alive. At the center of every longhouse burned the hearth, the heart of the family. It cooked meals, dried clothes, and purified the air, but more than that, it symbolized life itself. If the fire ever died, the cold would claim the house before dawn. Every Viking knew how to read a flame, how to feed it, calm it, protect it. Too much smoke meant damp wood. Too weak, and the cold crept in. Children learned early that tending fire was sacred work. In the sagas, an extinguished flame was often a sign of death, while a living fire meant the gods still watched over you. Keeping the hearth alive was not just about warmth, it was an act of faith. Survival demanded discipline. The Vikings understood the body like a weapon, how to preserve energy, conserve heat, and fight frost. They layered their clothing, linen against the skin, thick wool over it, fur cloaks sealing it all. Wool was their miracle fiber, warm even when wet, tough, and renewable. They slept side by side under heavy furs, sometimes with moss stuffed in their boots for insulation. Hygiene was rare. Water froze. Baths wasted fuel, but adaptation was constant. They did not expect comfort. They expected endurance. But even endurance had its cost. The air inside the Longhouse was thick and smoky. Coughing was common. Lungs blackened with soot. Illness spread quickly. Yet through it all, families relied on each other completely. Food, labor, warmth, everything was shared. In that closeness, a deep bond formed. The Vikings discovered that survival was not only about fire or food, it was about connection. Alone, a person froze. Together they endured. The darkness was not seen as punishment, it was a teacher. It taught patience, humility, and the rhythm of nature. When spring finally came, it was not just a season, it was a revelation. The return of the sun was celebrated with song, feasting, and fire rituals, reminders that even after the longest night, the light always returns. That cycled death and rebirth, darkness and dawn shaped everything in Viking life, from their mythology to their daily routines. Gods like Odin and Thor represented wisdom and endurance, the very traits that carried them through each brutal winter. Even today, in parts of Scandinavia, people still light candles through the dark months, echoing that ancient promise that light will always find its way home. So what can we, centuries later, learn from them? That survival is not about strength alone. It is about adaptability, resilience, and the courage to face what cannot be changed. It is about community, about the warmth that only shared struggle creates. And most of all, it is about faith, not blind belief, but trust in the rhythm of life itself. The night may seem endless, but it always yields to morning. When you find yourself in a long winter of your own, when life feels frozen, progress stops, and hope feels distant, remember the Viking Longhouse? Remember the shared breath, the steady fire, the whispered stories that kept spirits alive. Remember that even in 40-degree nights there was laughter, courage, and the quiet certainty that the sun would return. Because it always did. This is where our journey begins, in darkness, with firelight, and with the lesson that survival is not just a battle against nature, it is a story of what it means to be human. When you step into a Viking longhouse, it feels as if you are entering the lungs of a living creature, a structure that breathes, smokes, creaks, and exhales warmth into the endless cold. Every beam, every stone, every patch of turf was built not for beauty, but for survival. These were homes designed by necessity and perfected by experience. The Longhouse was more than a shelter. It was the center of Viking life, a place where families ate, slept, worked, prayed, and endured the winter together. Its design was a masterpiece of natural insulation. Long and narrow, the house stretched like a ship flipped upside down, a reminder that the same people who sailed through storms also mastered the land's coldest nights. The walls were made from thick turf blocks, cut from the ground and stacked like bricks, layered with straw and moss between them. This simple technique created a thermal barrier so efficient that it trapped heat from the inside and blocked icy winds from outside. The roof, sloping low to resist snow buildup, was covered in sod, a living blanket of grass and roots that sealed in warmth. When winter came, snow piled on top of the roof, but instead of being a burden, it became extra insulation. Nature was not fought here, it was used. Inside there were no windows. Only the faint orange glow of the central hearth pierced the darkness. Smoke curled slowly toward a small hole in the roof, and though the air was heavy and stung the eyes, that smoke served a strange purpose. It dried meat, repelled insects, and even acted as a preservative for wooden beams. Archaeologists have found soot-stained ceilings that show centuries of fire use, but also evidence that this smoke helped prevent rot. What would suffocate some, the Vikings turned into survival. The layout of the Longhouse followed a simple rule: warmth in the center, life around the edges. The main hearth sat right in the middle, burning day and night. To one side, the family's sleeping area raised wooden platforms lined with straw, furs, and wool blankets. To the other side, livestock pens, cows, goats, and sheep breathing steadily through the night. Their body heat added to the warmth of the room. You could call it primitive central heating, but it worked. Every inch of space had purpose. The roof beams hung with drying fish or meat. Storage pits beneath the floor held root vegetables or salted food. Even the smoke hole was carefully positioned, small enough to keep heat from escaping, but large enough to prevent suffocation. The Vikings, through generations of trial and error, had built something close to perfection, a system where every detail mattered. At night, the Longhouse was a world of whispers and breath. Families slept shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in fur, listening to the crackle of the fire and the muffled lowing of animals nearby. The darkness was thick, but not lonely. There was a comfort in the closeness, in the rhythm of shared breathing. For them, privacy was a luxury, survival was the priority. Yet, this environment came with its own price. The air was smoky, the smell heavy, and light scarce. People often suffered from coughs, eye irritation, and fatigue, but as harsh as it sounds, it was far better than the alternative, the freezing emptiness outside. Inside those smoky walls, warmth meant hope. The design of the Longhouse also revealed how deeply the Vikings understood the environment. The entrances faced away from the wind, usually toward the south or east. Floors were slightly lowered to keep cold air from seeping in. Thick wooden doors were reinforced with hides to prevent drafts. Even the animal stalls were built slightly lower than the human section, so the rising heat would drift toward the family's sleeping area. Every element of the house reflected one truth: they studied the cold until they learned to live with it. And then there was the fire, the soul of the house. It was not simply fuel and flame, it was identity. Many Viking families believed their household spirit, a guardian ancestor or landvatir, lived in the hearth. To let the fire die was not just dangerous, it was disrespectful. Before sleep, someone always checked the coals, covering them with ash to keep them alive till morning. If the embers dimmed too much, they whispered a small prayer not to a god of war or thunder, but to the humble spirit of the fire itself. When dawn finally came, if you could call it that, for the sun rarely rose high in winter, the Longhouse stirred. Someone fed the coals, someone milked the goats, someone mended clothing or checked the meat hanging from rafters. The rhythm was slow but steady. Inside that long, smoky hall, people found balance, a fragile but powerful harmony between man, beast, and nature. What is astonishing is how much of their wisdom still applies today. Modern architects studying Viking settlements in Iceland and Norway have recreated turf houses using ancient methods. and found that they remain incredibly efficient. In some reconstructions, the internal temperature stays around 15 to 18 degrees Celsius, even when the outside drops below -20 degrees Celsius. With only one small fire, no electricity, no modern insulation, just earth, wood, and intelligence, the Viking Longhouse was not just a building, it was a philosophy. It taught patience, cooperation, and respect for natural law. It reminded every person that survival was not about resisting the world, but about learning its rhythms. And so, as snow fell endlessly outside, the Longhouse remained alive, glowing faintly against the white darkness. Inside, a mother rocked a child, a father mended a spear, someone hummed an old tune, and in the air between smoke and silence, the warmth of life endured. That was the secret of the Longhouse, not its walls or its roof, but the spirit within them, the spirit that refused to surrender to the storm. The Longhouse could keep out the wind, but it could not follow the Vikings into the blizzard. For that, they carried their shelter on their backs in the form of wool, fur, and linen. To the Vikings, clothing was not fashion. It was armor, insulation, identity, and survival rolled into one. Imagine stepping outside at dawn, the horizon pale gray, frost clinging to every surface. The air bites like a blade. You can feel the moisture in your breath freezing against your lips. No one in this world steps outside unprepared. Every layer, every stitch has purpose. The base layer closest to the skin was often made of soft linen or finely woven wool. Linen wicked sweat away, keeping the body dry, while wool trapped warmth, even when damp. Over that came thicker tunics, woven by hand from coarse wool. The outermost layers were cloaks heavy, dense, and sometimes treated with animal fat or beeswax to repel snow and rain. In the north, fur was not luxury. It was necessity. Fox, reindeer, bear, or sheep pelts were worn inside out to trap heat and block wind. They used the same layering principle that modern explorers and mountaineers follow today: moisture control, insulation, and weather protection. 3 layers, thousands of years before the term thermal regulation existed. It was instinctive engineering born from generations of learning the hard way. Viking clothing was a blend of practicality and beauty. A wealthy man's cloak might be dyed deep red or blue, fastened with ornate bronze brooches, but beneath the decoration lay survival science. Every seam was reinforced, every hem double-stitched. Belts were not just for style. They carried tools, knives, pouches, the essentials of life in a frozen land. The women were the silent guardians of warmth. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were not domestic chores. They were acts of endurance. A well-made cloak could mean the difference between life and death during a snowstorm. The rhythmic sound of looms filled winter days inside the Longhouse, and every thread carried purpose. Archaeologists have found fragments of Viking textiles so densely woven that even modern machines struggle to replicate them. That is how seriously they took warmth. Gloves, boots, and head coverings were equally critical. Hands wrapped in felted wool or fur mittens stayed functional enough to grip weapons or tools. Feet were protected by leather boots, stuffed with straw, moss, or animal hair primitive insulation that worked astonishingly well. The Vikings even used layers of dried grass inside shoes, changing them daily to keep feet dry. Modern outdoor experts would call that smart moisture management. But there was something deeper about the way they dressed, a philosophy of respect for the materials themselves. Nothing was wasted. Wool came from sheep that shared their home. Leather came from animals they raised and thanked. Fur was taken with ritual and gratitude. Every garment told a story of labor, survival, and a connection between human and nature that we have mostly lost today. Stepping outside, a Viking wrapped in layers looked almost monumental. The cloak swayed with the wind, frost glittered on fur collars, and iron brooches caught the faint light. Each person became part of the landscape, not fighting it but blending with it. There was a quiet dignity in that balance. For children, winter clothing was often hand-me-down, patched and repaired dozens of times. The youngest wore wool tunics so long they nearly brushed the ground. The elderly, wrapped in multiple cloaks, rarely left the Longhouse. The middle-aged, those still strong enough to hunt or gather, bore the burden of exposure. Their faces burned from wind, their beards turned white with frost, but they endured it with grim pride. Washing clothes in winter was rare. Water sources froze solid, and the risk of damp garments meant risk of death. Instead, they aired clothing by the fire or scrubbed them with snow, a surprisingly effective method. The smoke from the hearth also coated fabric with a layer of soot and oil that helped repel moisture and pests. You could say the Vikings invented functional odor masking long before deodorant. In the dim glow of the fire, clothing repair was a nightly ritual. A mother mended torn sleeves, a daughter spun wool into thread, a son rubbed oil onto boots to keep the leather from cracking. These were quiet, humble acts of defiance against the cold. Each repair was a small victory, a declaration that they would not be defeated by nature. Even the way they slept was strategic. Before lying down, they kept their outer garments on, wrapping cloaks tightly, sleeping close together under heavy furs. Body heat was the most valuable resource in winter, and they used it wisely. They did not think of warmth as an individual privilege. It was a shared resource, something created and sustained together. In sagas and archaeological finds alike, we see that their relationship with clothing went beyond necessity. It was symbolic. A warrior's cloak was a mark of status. A woman's apron dress signified not just beauty but skill proof that she could weave life from thread. When someone died, they were buried in their best garments, because in the Norse mind, you carried your craftsmanship, your endurance, and your dignity into the afterlife. One story from the Icelandic sagas tells of a man lost in a blizzard. When his body was found months later, his cloak was still wrapped around him, frozen, solid, but intact. Locals said it was the wool, not the man, that outlasted the storm. There is a strange poetry in that the fabric woven by human hands becoming tougher than flesh, a symbol of how the Vikings merged with the world they lived in. So when we think of the Viking image, the hooded figure against the snow, the fur-lined cloak, the steady gaze beneath frost-covered brows, we are not just looking at history. We are looking at an entire survival system built into what they wore. Their clothing was warmth, armor, and identity, a statement of defiance to a world that tried every day to freeze them out. In the modern world, we chase warmth with technology heaters, electricity, synthetic fibers, but the Vikings built it through wisdom. They listened to the wind, studied the cold, and wrapped themselves in the knowledge of those who came before. Every fold of wool was memory. Every thread was survival. When the storm howled across the fjords and ice crystals cut through the air, the Vikings did not shiver in fear. They pulled their cloaks tighter, lowered their heads, and walked straight into the snow. Because they understood a truth we often forget, that warmth is not found. It is made. Night in a Viking winter was not a gentle thing. It was a test, long, slow, and silent. When the sun slipped beneath the horizon, it did not rise again for what felt like forever. The air outside turned to glass, hard and sharp, freezing everything it touched. Inside the Longhouse, the only thing separating life from death was a faint, flickering fire. Imagine lying there, wrapped in furs, surrounded by the rhythmic sound of breathing children, elders, animals. The space is tight, smoky, and warm only near the hearth. Beyond that glow, shadows shift and vanish into total darkness. You can't see the walls, but you can feel the weight of the night pressing against them. The fire crackles. A cow shifts in its stall. Someone coughs softly in their sleep. The Longhouse is alive, a fragile island of warmth in an ocean of cold. For the Vikings, sleeping through the night was not simply resting, it was surviving. They did not sleep deeply or for long stretches. Their sleep was fragmented, broken into cycles of rest and wakefulness. Some would rise in the middle of the night to feed the fire, check the livestock, or simply stare into the embers. It was not insomnia, it was vigilance. The fire must never die. If the flames faded, the temperature inside could drop dangerously within hours. Keeping the fire alive was a sacred duty. Each household had a firekeeper, sometimes a parent, sometimes an older child who would wake throughout the night to tend to the embers. They would carefully stir the ashes, add moss or bark, and whisper small blessings to keep the warmth steady. It was not superstition. It was routine built on centuries of survival. A cold hearth meant death. Sleep itself was a communal act. Families did not have separate rooms or beds. Everyone slept together on raised wooden platforms, lined with straw and covered with animal hides. They lay side by side, often overlapping, using body heat to preserve energy. The elderly were placed closest to the fire, children in the middle, and adults on the outer edges, forming a living shield against the cold. Warmth, like food, was shared equally. But even inside, the cold found ways to creep in. Frost formed on the walls, breath crystallized in midair, and the floor stayed damp no matter how much straw was laid. The Vikings learned to sleep without moving too much, conserving heat like animals in hibernation. They tucked their hands under cloaks, curled their knees to their chest, and let the rhythm of shared breathing lull them back into dreams. Those dreams were vivid, shaped by darkness, flickering firelight, and stories told before bed. In a world without clocks or streetlights, night had no clear boundaries. It was a place of both rest and imagination. The sagas tell us that many believed dreams could reveal messages from ancestors or gods. Some claimed to see omens in the flicker of the flames, or the pattern of ashes at dawn. Whether those visions were real or born from exhaustion, they gave meaning to the endless dark, and meaning was everything. Without it, despair could creep in. Darkness has a strange way of weighing on the mind. For months, the sun was only a faint rumor, a ghost of light that barely touched the horizon. Some people grew quiet, withdrawn. Others filled the silence with songs, jokes, or stories. Laughter, in its own way, was as necessary as heat. Around the fire, they told tales of brave ancestors, trickster gods, and great battles. Stories that reminded them that every night, no matter how long, eventually ends. This storytelling was more than entertainment. It was medicine. When fear or fatigue took hold, words became the cure. Children drifted to sleep listening to sagas of Thor's hammer or Odin's wisdom, while adults found comfort in repeating the same tales they had heard since childhood. The fire flickered. Shadows danced on the walls, and for a few hours the world outside disappeared. But survival was not just physical or emotional. It was social. In the Longhouse, Everyone depended on everyone else. If one person neglected the fire, the whole family froze. If one person grew ill, the others had to take their tasks. Food was rationed carefully, and decisions were made communally. There was no space for selfishness. The cold punished it instantly. In many ways, the Viking Longhouse was a lesson in cooperation. The closer the people slept, the more warmth they generated. The more they shared food and chores, the more efficiently they used their energy. And beyond the practical, there was something deeper, a bond, born of shared survival. When you have spent months breathing the same smoky air, listening to the same wind, relying on the same flame, you stop being a collection of individuals. You become one organism, fighting the cold together. Sometimes the night brought danger from within. Sparks could ignite the straw. A log might roll too far from the hearth and start a fire. The animals could panic in the dark. A storm could tear through the roof or block the doorway with snow. The Vikings learned to sleep lightly, one ear always open to sound. Danger, in this world, was constant, but so was endurance. There was beauty in those nights, too, a strange, haunting beauty. When the wind fell silent, and the fire burned low, you could hear the snow settling outside. The world felt still, frozen in time. The stars, when visible through a crack in the roof, shone brighter than ever, as if the heavens leaned closer to watch these tiny lights of humanity flicker against the endless dark. And in those moments, in the hush between fire crackles, the Vikings felt what we all feel when facing the unknown, a fragile but powerful sense of awe. The same awe that made them explorers, poets, and warriors. They did not just survive the night, they learned from it. They learned patience, humility, and the quiet strength that comes from enduring together. By the time dawn arrived, if dawn could truly be called that, since the sun barely climbed above the mountains, the fire would be stirred again. The smell of smoke and cooked grain filled the air. Children stirred, rubbing frost from their hair. The first sound of a goat's bleat broke the silence. And slowly, life began again. In a world where survival depended on warmth, fire was more than fuel. It was faith, and each night they survived was proof that even in the darkest places, the human spirit burns just a little brighter than the cold can extinguish. When you live in a land where the earth sleeps for half the year, food is not just sustenance, it is strategy. For the Vikings, every meal was a victory over the cold. Every stored root or salted fish, a promise of one more day alive. Eating in winter was not about flavor. It was about endurance, planning, and respect for the resources that nature allowed. Imagine the first light of a pale winter morning. The fire is rekindled. The Longhouse slowly stirs, and the air fills with the smell of something earthy, barley, turnips, or dried fish simmering in a pot over the hearth. There is no feast, no excess, just survival fuel, measured carefully and shared equally. During summer and autumn, the Vikings prepared for this moment with almost military discipline. They hunted, fished, harvested, and stored everything they could. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Fish was hung on racks to air cure in the northern wind. Grains like barley and rye were ground and stored in wooden barrels. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, onions were buried in cellars insulated with straw. Even milk was preserved as cheese or butter, while some of it became a fermented drink called surmjölk, a kind of sour milk that could last through the dark months. Each household had a strict ration system. A family of 6 might have only a few barrels of grain and a dozen smoked meats to last the season. Meals were simple, predictable, and practical. Morning started with porridge made of barley or oats, flavored if lucky with a spoon of honey or a scrap of butter. Lunch and dinner were stews, thick, hearty, and endlessly reheated. Every ingredient had a purpose: grains for energy, fat for warmth, and protein for strength. In these conditions, fat was the true treasure. Animal fat, lard, and butter were as valuable as gold. They were stored carefully, melted into stews, or spread over bread to keep the body burning through the cold. A Viking knew that if the fire in the hearth was for warmth, fat was the fire inside the body. Even drink had meaning. Water often froze or became unsafe, so fermented beverages became essential. Weak ale, brewed from barley, was a daily staple, not to get drunk, but to stay hydrated and nourished. Mead, the honey-based drink of myth, was rarer, reserved for celebration or ritual. During Yule, the midwinter feast, the first horn of mead was raised to the gods, the ancestors, and the spirits of the land. It was not just drinking, it was a way of saying thank you for letting us live another season. The act of eating was deeply spiritual. The Vikings believed that food was a gift from both the earth and the gods. Before every meal, some would toss a small piece into the fire, an offering to household spirits known as landvetir. It was a small gesture, but a powerful one. Even when they had little, they gave thanks. Mealtime was also the social heartbeat of the Longhouse. It was the one time of day when everyone gathered together, men, women, children, and even elders who could barely sit upright. The bowl passed from hand to hand, each taking their share without complaint. There were no personal plates. Everything was communal. Eating together was more than habit. It was a reaffirmation of unity. The light of the hearth flickered on their faces as they ate in silence or told quiet stories. The fire's smoke mixed with the steam from the stew, filling the air with a sense of comfort that went beyond warmth. For a few brief minutes, as they ate, the outside world disappeared. The cold, the storms, the endless night, all of it felt far away. Sometimes, when supplies ran low, creativity became the only spice. Bread was stretched with bark powder or crushed bones. Soups were thickened with whatever could be found: dried peas, bits of moss, or even fish skin. Hunger made people resourceful. They learned to find nourishment where others might see nothing. Animals, too, were part of the cycle. A single pig could feed a family for weeks. Nothing went to waste. Meat for food, bones for tools, fat for candles, hide for clothing. When an animal was slaughtered, it was done with ceremony, a recognition that life fed life. The Vikings lived close to death and understood its necessity. To waste was to insult both nature and the gods. Then came Yule, the festival that marked the darkest days of the year. For 12 nights, fires burned brighter, and feasts replaced famine. Families gathered, neighbors visited, songs were sung, and sacrifices made. It was the celebration of survival, the moment when people looked at each other and said, "We have made it halfway." They roasted boar, poured mead, and raised their horns to Odin, Freyr, and their ancestors. The feast was not just indulgence, it was hope. It reminded them that even in endless darkness, joy was still possible. Around the fire, the old told stories, while the young listened wide-eyed. Myths of creation, courage, and rebirth flowed like mead tales, meant to keep the spirit strong. Every story, every song, every bite of meat shared around that fire was a small rebellion against despair. The Vikings knew that surviving winter required not only strength of body, but also strength of heart. Food, in the Viking world, was never just about hunger. It was about connection to each other, to the land, to the unseen forces they believed watched over them. Every spoonful of stew was a thread in a much larger fabric of survival and faith. As the fire burned low, bowls were emptied, and the last crumbs brushed into the flames as an offering. The Longhouse grew quiet again. The smoke curled upward like a prayer. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside, bellies were full, spirits were lifted, and the flames still burned. That was the secret of Viking endurance. They did not simply fight against the cold. They fed their strength, both physical and spiritual. Their food was not gourmet, but it was sacred. Their rituals were not fancy, but they were powerful. Each meal said the same thing: "We are still here." And as they lay down once more beneath the firs, the last glow of the fire reflected in their eyes, they knew that survival was not a matter of luck. It was a choice made every day, one shared bowl at a time. There comes a point in the Viking winter when the cold stops being an enemy you can see and becomes something quieter, more dangerous, something that seeps into the mind. The darkness is no longer outside the walls. It begins to live inside you. Imagine waking up and not knowing if it is morning or night. The sky never truly brightens. The sun hovers weakly, like a ghost that refuses to return. Time itself blurs. The fire still burns, but even its light feels smaller. In that endless twilight, something begins to change in the human heart. The Vikings knew this feeling well. They called it skamdegi, the short days. To them, winter was not just a physical trial, it was a spiritual and emotional test. The cold could break bones, but the darkness could break minds. Inside the Longhouse, people began to slow down. Conversations grew softer, movements more deliberate. There were days when no one spoke at all. The world outside was silent, muffled by snow, and that silence crept in like fog. In this season, despair was as real a threat as hunger. But the Vikings, in their strange wisdom, had ways to fight it, not with medicine or philosophy, but with something older and deeper: ritual, faith, and connection. At the heart of their belief was balance. They knew that the world moved in cycles, light and dark, life and death, summer and winter. The darkness was not evil. It was simply the other side of existence. That understanding gave them peace. They did not curse the winter. They accepted it as part of the great turning of time. Their myths reflected that balance. They believed that even the gods faced cold and shadow. Odin sacrificed his own eye for wisdom. Balder, the god of light, was killed and sent to the underworld, only to be promised rebirth after the final winter of Ragnarok. The message was clear: even light must die before it can return. Each night, when the fire dimmed and the air thickened with smoke, families gathered close and whispered prayers, not always to beg for warmth or food, but to keep their courage alive. Some prayed to Thor, the protector, to keep the storms away. Others murmured to Frigg, goddess of home and love, asking her to watch over the sleeping children. The belief itself was a form of strength, a light that could not be extinguished. Storytelling became sacred during these months. The skald, or storyteller, was not just an entertainer, they were a healer. Through words, they stitched sanity back together. They told of gods walking among men, of warriors who defied death, of journeys across frozen seas. Each tale was a spark in the darkness, reminding listeners that they were part of something larger than the winter around them. The Vikings also relied on sound. The rhythm of hammers on iron, the hum of a spinning wheel, the steady drip of melting snow into buckets by the fire. Routine itself was medicine. Work meant purpose, and purpose meant survival. And when despair grew too heavy, they turned to nature even in its frozen form. Some stepped outside to breathe the icy air and look at the stars that pierced the northern sky. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, shimmered above them, ribbons of green and red dancing across the heavens. To the Vikings, this was no mere light show. It was the armor of the gods, glowing to remind mortals that the divine still watched over them. There were also darker beliefs, stories of spirits that wandered in winter. The Draugr, the restless dead, said to rise from frozen graves. The Huldafolk, hidden folk who lived beneath hills and could bless or curse those who disturbed them. These tales carried warnings, but also comfort. They made the unseen world feel familiar. In a landscape where the line between life and death blurred daily, believing in spirits was a way to make sense of the unknown. Faith was not confined to temples or priests. It lived in the smallest moments, in the way someone stirred a pot, or how they touched the wall before leaving home. These rituals gave order to chaos. They reminded people that even in a world ruled by frost, they still had power, not over nature, but over fear. The Vikings also understood that laughter was sacred. During Yule, when food was scarce and cold unrelenting, they made jokes, sang songs, and performed games by firelight. Laughter was not denial, it was rebellion. To laugh in the face of the storm was to say, "You cannot break me." Psychologists today would call this resilience. To the Vikings, it was simply life. They did not analyze their emotions or label their struggles. They met darkness the way they met everything, by enduring it together. Children played quietly with carved toys near the fire. Elders shared stories of winters long past. Lovers whispered under firs, sharing warmth not just of the body but of the spirit. The Longhouse became a cocoon, a world within a world, and though the snow outside grew taller, the people inside grew closer. When spring finally came, the return of light was more than a change of season. It was resurrection. The first true sunrise after months of gray could move grown men to tears. Farmers would walk outside, kneel, and press their hands into thawing earth. Children would run and laugh at their own shadows, as if rediscovering joy itself. In that moment, the Vikings understood something profound, that light only means something because darkness exists, that hope is not born in comfort, it is forged in the cold, and that the human spirit, like fire, burns brightest when the night is at its deepest. They did not survive winter through strength alone. They survived because they believed in the gods, in the cycle of the world, and in each other. So when we look back at them now, at the sagas, the carvings, the graves, we are not just studying warriors or explorers. We are seeing people who stared into months of darkness and chose not to surrender. They lit their fires, told their stories, and kept their faith alive until the sun returned. And perhaps that is the truest legacy they left us, the understanding that endurance is not silence, and faith is not blindness. It is the courage to keep going when there is no sign of dawn, to trust that, even in the longest night, the light is already on its way. When the land froze solid and rivers turned to glass, most people of the ancient world retreated indoors, waiting for warmth to return. But the Vikings were not. Most people, to them, the frozen landscape was not an obstacle, it was a weapon. Ice became their road, snow their camouflage, and winter their ally. While others hid from the storm, the Northmen moved through it. The first thing to understand is this: For a Viking, travel was life. Trade, war, exploration, none of it paused for weather. The same people who ruled the seas with longships ruled the land with sleds and skis. When fjords froze and the ships could no longer sail, they adapted. They built sleighs to carry goods, strapped wooden skis to their boots, and glided silently across the white horizon. Archaeologists have found Viking skis more than 1,000 years old, carved from pine and ash, with leather bindings that held to wool-wrapped feet. These were not crude toys. They were precision tools, light, flexible, and built for endurance. A skilled skier could cover miles of snowy forest faster than a man on foot could in summer. The Norse word skeið, meaning a split piece of wood, gives us the modern word ski. It was invention born from necessity. They also used sleds drawn by horses or oxen, loaded with supplies and furs. Roads did not exist in winter. Instead, rivers and frozen lakes became highways. The cold, in its cruel irony, made travel easier. The very ice that killed crops and sealed harbors created smooth, unbroken paths across the land. But moving across this world demanded more than skill. It demanded instinct. The Vikings learned to read snow like sailors read the sea. The texture of the crust, the color of the drifts, the way the wind carved the surface. Each detail told a story. Fresh powder meant hidden danger. Gray ice meant weak ice. They listened to the land as if it spoke to them, because in a way, it did. Sometimes travel was peaceful merchants, hauling goods between settlements, families visiting kin, hunters tracking elk across the tundra. But other times, it was war. The Viking sagas tell of raids launched even in winter, when enemies least expected it. A small band of warriors could ski through the forest under moonlight, their cloaks blending with snow, their breath barely visible in the freezing air. They moved like ghosts, swift and silent. By dawn they could be miles away, striking isolated farms or outposts before disappearing again into the white. This was not madness, it was mastery. Winter raids were psychological warfare. The enemy believed no sane man would fight in such cold. That assumption was often fatal. In Norway, sagas speak of skidfari, the ski runners, scouts and messengers who crossed entire mountain ranges carrying news or warnings. Some of these men became legends. One tale, immortalized centuries later, tells of two warriors who skied through the blizzard carrying an infant prince, the future King Hakon IV, to safety, while enemies pursued them through the night. Their speed and endurance saved the royal bloodline. Even today, Norwegians honor that journey through the Birkebeiner ski race, a living echo of Viking resilience. But not all journeys were heroic. Sometimes they were desperate. Hunters trapped in sudden storms, travelers lost in whiteouts, traders caught on thin ice. The North could turn from ally to executioner in a heartbeat. A misjudged step could send a man plunging into black water beneath the ice. If he could not get out within minutes, the cold claimed him silently. The Vikings feared little, but they respected nature's cruelty. Before crossing a frozen river, they would tap the ice with spears or axes, listening for the hollow sound of weakness. They avoided shaded areas where meltwater lurked beneath the surface. They traveled in pairs or groups, always ready to pull one another back from death's edge. Weapons were adapted for the season too. Axes were sharpened not only for battle, but for cutting wood and ice. Shields doubled as sleds. Cloaks were layered with oil or wax to repel moisture. Helmets, when worn in the cold, were lined with fur or wool to prevent frostbite. Even warfare, brutal as it was, bowed to the demands of the season. Battles fought in snow were rare, but terrifying. The clash of metal was muffled by the wind. Footsteps vanished in the drifts, and the wounded froze where they fell. Blood steamed briefly before turning black on the snow. It was said that a Viking who could fight in winter feared no man because he had already faced nature itself. But not every winter journey was violent. Many were acts of survival and trade. The Vikings did not isolate themselves from the world. They stayed connected, even in the harshest months. Winter markets were held on frozen lakes where traders set up tents over the ice. There, goods changed hands: fur, amber, salt, metal, even stories. The sound of laughter and bargaining drifted over the frozen surface, proof that even in deep winter, life went on. Traveling in the cold taught them patience and trust. A man who shared a road in winter shared risk. Every journey required cooperation. One man led the horse, another checked the ice, another carried supplies. They read each other's faces as carefully as they read the land. A single moment of carelessness could doom them all. And yet they went again and again across snowfields, over mountains, through forests so silent that even the sound of their breathing felt sacred. The journey itself became a kind of prayer. To move forward, even when the world froze around you, was to defy the limits of human endurance. By the time spring came, those who survived were changed. Their skin was burned by wind, their beards frozen into hard knots, their hands calloused and scarred, but their spirits were unbroken. They had walked across death's doorstep and returned stronger. Travel and war in Viking winter were not acts of recklessness. They were acts of understanding. The Vikings did not see themselves as separate from nature, but as part of it, children of frost and fire, moving in rhythm with the land. They used what others feared. They learned that even ice can carry you forward, if you have the courage to step on it. And perhaps that is the lesson they leave behind for us. Movement is survival. When the world grows cold, literally or metaphorically, do not stop. Keep moving. Keep breathing. Keep pushing across the frozen ground, because like the Vikings, once you learn to walk with the winter instead of against it, even the storm begins to follow your lead. When the world freezes and the days vanish into endless night, death feels closer. The boundary between the living and the dead grows thin, so thin that the Vikings believed the two realms could touch. In the silence of winter, every sound outside the Longhouse, a creak, a whisper, a step in the snow, could be a spirit passing by. Death was not a stranger in the Viking world. It was a constant companion. The cold took the weak, the storms swallowed the lost, and hunger claimed those who miscalculated their stores. But to the Vikings, death was not the end. It was transformation. Life, death, and rebirth formed a cycle as natural as the seasons. Just as the earth slept in winter and awakened in spring, so too did they believe souls traveled through darkness to reach light again. Inside the Longhouse, people lived with death's presence every day. A chair left empty by the fire might belong to someone who had passed in a storm the year before. When the wind howled around the walls, mothers would murmur, "The old ones are visiting." It was not fear, it was reverence. The dead were never gone. They simply walked in another world, close enough to be felt. The Norse had no single heaven or hell. Their afterlife was a landscape of many paths. Warriors sought Valhalla, where Odin welcomed them to feast and fight until the world's end. Farmers and craftsmen might go to Folkvanger, the meadow of Freya, goddess of love and fertility. Others returned to Hell, not a place of punishment, but a cold, quiet realm where souls rested, ruled by Hel, the daughter of Loki. Each destination reflected not moral judgment, but the life one lived. But winter changed the way the living interacted with the dead. When the ground froze solid, proper burials became impossible. Bodies were sometimes kept in outbuildings or caves, wrapped in furs and herbs, waiting for the thaw. It was a practical act, yet it carried a deep sense of unease. The line between burial and return was fragile. To keep the spirits calm, families placed offerings beside the body's food, coins, or locks of hair. They whispered words of farewell, asking the dead to rest until the earth softened again. Failing to show respect was dangerous. The Vikings believed in Draugr, the restless dead corpses that refused to stay buried, rising from frozen graves to haunt those who wronged them. The Draugr was not a ghost, but something physical, a dead body filled with unnatural strength and anger. Some said they guarded treasure. Others believed they sought revenge. Graves were often sealed with heavy stones or iron nails to keep the body still. Warriors were buried with weapons so they could defend themselves in the afterlife, but sometimes those weapons were deliberately bent or broken, a sign to the spirit that its battle on earth was done. Fear of the Draugr shaped rituals of death. Before burial, a body's shoes were tied together to prevent it from walking. Nails were driven into the soles of the feet. The grave was oriented so that, if the dead rose, they would walk away from the village, not toward it. Even in their practical genius, the Vikings never underestimated the power of what they could not see. Yet, death was not only terror, it was also continuity. Families often buried their dead close to their homes, under mounds that overlooked the fields. These mounds became symbols of protection, ancestors watching over the land. During Yule, offerings were left on the mounds, bits of bread, ale, or meat. Children were taught to bow when passing by. It was not superstition, it was memory. On nights when storms shook the Longhouse and the wind screamed through the rafters, some whispered that the wild hunt was riding Odin himself, leading a host of spirits through the sky. To hear their galloping hooves or the cries of their hounds was both omen and blessing. The hunt symbolized the gathering of souls, a reminder that even in death the gods were active, collecting the fallen and renewing the world's balance. In this way, winter became the season of the unseen. Fire was not just warmth. It was protection, a glowing boundary that kept darkness, both literal and spiritual, at bay. When someone died, their family might keep the hearth burning for 3 nights straight, so the spirit could find its way to the afterlife safely. The living would speak softly, avoiding loud laughter or arguments, so as not to disturb the soul's journey. Women, especially the vulva, the seeresses, played a vital role in this relationship with the dead. They were believed to walk between worlds, communicating with spirits, and reading omens in fire, smoke, or bones. Wrapped in furs and bearing staffs carved with runes, these women led ceremonies that bound the living and the dead in harmony. Their chants filled the air with a strange, haunting rhythm, a reminder that faith and fear often shared the same heartbeat. One legend tells of a winter when the dead would not rest. Graves cracked open after a storm, and villagers began to vanish. A vulva was summoned. She entered the burial field alone, lit a torch, and called out to the spirits by name. When dawn came, the storm had stopped. The people said she had convinced the dead to return to their sleep. Whether it was truth or story, it shows how the Vikings faced fear not by running from it, but by speaking to it. Death was not an interruption to life, it was woven into it. The Vikings spoke to their ancestors, built their homes near graves, and celebrated the Yule feast as both a remembrance and renewal. Every flicker of fire, every shared drink, every story told by the hearth connected them across time. And perhaps that is what gave them strength. They did not see winter as an ending, only as a pause, a deep breath before life began again. When they buried their dead beneath the snow, they did so with faith that spring would come, and the earth, like the soul, would rise once more. In the end, the Vikings' relationship with death was not morbid. It was intimate. They did not deny it or hide it. They accepted it as a companion, a shadow walking beside them through the frost. In their darkest season, they found meaning not by avoiding mortality, but by honoring it, by believing that even in the coldest night the spirit endures, watching, waiting, ready to awaken with the dawn. After months of darkness, silence, and frost, the first drop of water was enough to make people cry. It began quietly, a faint drip, like the heartbeat of the world returning. The ice that had sealed the rivers began to crack. Snow melted from the rooftops in slow, deliberate streams. The air, still sharp and thin, carried a smell it had not held for months, the scent of earth. For the Vikings, this was not just the change of a season. It was resurrection. Inside the Longhouse, the fire still burned, but now the smoke rose in thinner ribbons. The heavy furs that had hung over the doorway were lifted aside, letting sunlight weak and golden spill across the dirt floor. Children, who had spent months playing in shadows, blinked at the brightness as if seeing the gods themselves. Old men walked outside for the first time in weeks, leaning on staffs, breathing the thawing air like a blessing. The thaw transformed everything. Streams gurgled where there had been silence. The sky softened from steel gray to pale blue, kumwa. Birds returned, cautious at first, then bold, calling out as if to announce the end of suffering. The land, once frozen and still, began to stir. The Vikings celebrated this moment, not with one feast, but with a season of gratitude. The festival that followed was called Varblo, the Spring Sacrifice. It marked the end of winter's grip and the beginning of renewal. Offerings were made to the gods, Odin for wisdom, Thor for strength, and Freyr for fertility and abundance. In some villages, farmers poured ale into the soil to wake it, believing that the earth drank with them. Fires were lit on hillsides, but unlike the hearth fires of winter, these were bright and open flames of joy, not survival. People sang, laughed, and danced around them, shaking off the heaviness that had clung to their spirits for months. It was said that the louder the celebration, the faster the sun would climb in the sky. Every spring the world was reborn, and so were its people. After the long confinement of winter, even the simplest acts felt miraculous: washing clothes in running water, feeling mud beneath boots, watching green shoots push through thawed soil. Each small sign of life carried enormous meaning. The Vikings saw it as proof that the gods had not abandoned them, that their endurance had been rewarded. But the thaw was not only physical, it was emotional. People laughed more, sang louder, and told stories in daylight instead of whispers. The Longhouse, once a sanctuary, opened its doors wide. Neighbors visited again, bringing gifts of dried fish or grain. Friendships rekindled, like the fires outside. The world that had been locked in silence began to hum again. Still, the Vikings did not forget what they would survive. Spring was celebration, but also remembrance. The first feast of the season always included an offering for the dead, bread left on the mound, mead poured on the soil. They believed the ancestors helped bring the light back. The living and the dead shared the thaw together. Farmers returned to their fields, feeling the soil's chill between their fingers. Hunters repaired their weapons, traders prepared their ships, and the warriors, the restless ones who had waded through the cold, stood on cliffs, overlooking the melting sea, watching as the ice broke apart. The sound was thunderous, as if the world itself were breathing again. That moment meant freedom, the call to move, to explore, to live once more. In sagas, spring was often described as a promise, the return of balance. Just as day follows night, warmth follows cold, and life follows death. But the Vikings did not take it for granted. They knew that survival was never guaranteed. Each thaw was a second chance, a gift earned through endurance, cooperation, and faith, and so they marked it with ceremony. In some regions, women carried torches through the village at night, symbolizing the return of light. Children followed with laughter, scattering ash from the winter fire, a way to feed the soil and remind the land that the people still cared for it. It was both ritual and renewal. Even nature itself seemed to join the celebration. Streams roared louder, animals emerged from hiding, and the northern wind softened into a song. The same cold air that once burned skin now carried the smell of moss, pine, and wet ground. In this season, love returned too. Weddings were held, alliances formed, and promises renewed. After the long separation of winter, hearts thawed as easily as the rivers. Life, it seemed, was always waiting just beneath the ice. At night, families gathered again around the hearth, but now the fire was no longer a desperate guardian against death. It was a storyteller. Flames danced freely, reflecting in eyes that no longer held exhaustion but peace. The same sagas that once gave comfort in darkness were now told with laughter. They spoke of gods who traveled through endless winters and returned triumphant, of men who faced death and found wisdom, of the eternal cycle that binds all things. In every word, the same truth echoed: light always returns. The thaw taught the Vikings something profound, that endurance was not about denying pain, but about believing it would end. The snow, the hunger, the fear, the endless night, all of it was part of a larger rhythm, one they had learned to trust. By the time the fields turned green again, the Longhouse stood proud. Scarred with smoke, but still strong, the people within were leaner, wiser, and grateful. They had faced the silence of death and chosen life, not once, but every single day. And as the sun rose higher, casting gold across the melting land, one truth bound them all, a truth whispered from one generation to the next. The winter tests us, but the spring remembers. When we look back across more than 1,000 years at the people of the North, the Vikings who lived through winters long enough to break most men, we often imagine savagery, strength, or conquest. But beneath the myths of warriors and raiders lies a quieter truth. Their greatest victories were not won on battlefields, but in the silence of survival. The long winter was their teacher, and its lessons still speak to us today. The Vikings lived in a world of extremes, blazing summer light and suffocating winter dark. They could not change their environment, so they learned to move with it. That, perhaps, is their first and greatest lesson. Do not fight the inevitable. Adapt to it. When the cold came, they did not curse it. They built houses that breathed with the land, clothes that mimicked animal warmth, and communities that functioned as one living organism. They accepted nature's laws and worked within them. We, who live in an age of climate control and convenience, could learn something from that humility. When the world around us feels hostile, whether through chaos, change, or uncertainty, the Viking response was not panic. It was preparation. They believed that survival began long before danger arrived. Every task, no matter how small, storing grain, repairing roofs, sewing cloaks, was an act of foresight. They knew that the future belongs to those who prepare for it. In modern life, where we chase comfort and speed, that mindset feels almost revolutionary. Endurance begins in the ordinary. The second lesson is the power of community. A Viking longhouse was more than wood and turf. It was the sum of its people. Every ember of warmth, every bite of food, every breath of shared air came from collective effort. No one survived alone, not even the strongest warrior. In the cold, individuality could kill. Cooperation kept you alive. They understood that survival was not a contest, but a collaboration. When they huddled together through the night, they did not see weakness in needing others. They saw wisdom. Today, in a world obsessed with independence, that truth feels like a light we have forgotten to tend. Sometimes, the bravest thing is not to stand alone, but to reach out and say, "We will make it together." The third lesson lies in their relationship with story and belief. In the long dark, when there was nothing to see but fire and shadow, they turned to stories to keep the mind alive. Myths of gods and monsters were not escapism. They were resilience in disguise. They reminded people that even in chaos, there was order. Even in loss, there was meaning. When the world outside was frozen, imagination became fire. We do the same, in our own ways, through books, art, faith, and conversation. The Vikings teach us that stories are not luxuries. They are survival tools for the soul. Every culture that endures hardship creates stories to outlive it. That is how humans turn suffering into wisdom. The fourth lesson is respect for the earth, for death, for limits. The Vikings did not waste, because waste meant death. They treated their environment with reverence, not dominance. When they slaughtered an animal, they used everything: the meat for food, the bones for tools, the hide for warmth. When they buried their dead, they honored them as guardians, not ghosts. They understood that life and death feed each other in a cycle too sacred to break. Our modern world, with its hunger for endless growth, often forgets that balance. We build without listening, take without thanking, move without noticing. The Vikings remind us that to survive in the long run, we must live with the world, not against it. The land is not our enemy. It is our mirror. The fifth and final lesson is perhaps the most important. Endurance is not about strength. It is about spirit. The Vikings were not invincible. They got sick, afraid, and lost like anyone else. But what kept them alive was not muscle or weapons. It was mindset. They believed in cycles. They knew that no storm lasts forever. No night is endless. Their faith was not in control, but in continuity. When darkness came, they did not despair. They prepared the fire. When spring returned, they did not forget. They gave thanks. That rhythm, hardship and hope, struggle and renewal shaped their entire worldview, and it is one we need now more than ever. Because we all have winters, moments when the light feels far away, when progress freezes, when we are trapped inside the walls of our own fears. Some winters are literal, others are emotional. Loss, loneliness, uncertainty. These are the modern blizzards we face. The Viking way teaches us that the answer is never to run from the cold, but to meet it, to endure it, to learn from it. When life grows cold, build your longhouse. Gather your people. Tell your stories. Feed your inner fire. Remember that warmth is something humans make, not something the world owes us. And when the thaw comes, because it always does, remember to honor it, to thank the dark for what it taught you, to carry the strength of the cold into the light. Vikings did not survive because they were stronger than the world. They survived because they understood it. They learned that the same force that freezes rivers also shapes the mountains. That the same silence that kills also teaches you to listen. That even the longest night ends, not in despair, but in dawn. So the next time you face your own winter, when everything seems frozen, when the path forward disappears, think of them. The families huddled under firs, the fire burning low, the snow pressing against the walls, and yet the faint sound of laughter in the dark. They endured not because they had to, but because they believed they could. That is the truest legacy of the North. Not conquest, not fearlessness, but faith in endurance. A belief that no matter how deep the cold runs, the human heart burns deeper still. And when you step out into your own thaw, when the first light breaks through after all that silence, you will understand what they did. That survival is not just about making it through the winter. It is about carrying its lessons with you long after the snow is gone. More than 1,000 years have passed since the last Viking longship sailed across a frozen fjord. The old sagas have become history. The Longhouses turned to earth, and the gods who once filled the night sky now live in books and museums. And yet if you travel north far enough into the lands of Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Denmark, or Greenland, you will feel it. That same quiet strength still lingers in the air. The Viking spirit never died. It simply changed shape. The people of the North still live with winter as a fact of life, not a passing inconvenience. Snow falls for months, daylight shrinks to hours, and the cold becomes a companion rather than an enemy. But look closely. You will see that the old Viking ways still echo in their rhythm of living, in their silence, in their humor, in their resilience. Take the concept of friluftsliv, a Norwegian word that means open-air life. It describes the deep love of being outdoors, even when the weather is harsh. To walk through a storm, to breathe in the cold air, to feel the sting of snow on your face, these are not miseries. They are small acts of connection with nature. It is the same idea that kept the Vikings alive, the belief that the world, even when brutal, must be embraced, not avoided. In Iceland, you will hear another word, "Þetta reddast." It means, loosely, it will all work out, but it is not blind optimism. It is a kind of pragmatic hope. Life is unpredictable. Storms come, ships sink, plans fail, but somehow things find their balance again. It is the same attitude that helped Viking families face the unknown, the faith that no matter how hard the winter, there will always be a spring. Even the modern design of Scandinavian homes, clean lines, natural light, minimal clutter, echoes that Viking sensibility. The Longhouse was practical, not decorative. Every object had purpose. The same principle lives on today in Hyades, the Danish and Norwegian idea of creating warmth, comfort, and intimacy in dark times. Candles, soft light, shared meals. It is the modern form of sitting around the hearth in a smoky longhouse, telling stories while snow falls outside. The tools have changed, but the feeling has not. The Old Norse respect for community also endures. In Iceland, the entire population, barely more than 380,000 people, functions like a vast, extended family. When storms close roads or volcanic ash darkens the sky, neighbors help neighbors. The old Viking belief in shared strength still guides them. If one person suffers, everyone suffers. In Norway's far north, where daylight disappears for weeks, towns organize Lysfest festivals of light during the darkest month. It is more than celebration. It is ritual. Fire, music, laughter, all symbols of defiance against the cold, just as the Vikings once lit Yule fires to remind themselves that light would return. Modern Norwegians kindle lanterns and fireworks for the same purpose. The story repeats, only the form changes. Even their attitude toward death and hardship carries that ancient echo. In Scandinavia, people often speak of lagom, not too much, not too little, the idea of balance. It is a philosophy born from living close to the edge, where excess meant waste and greed led to ruin. It is the same wisdom that guided Viking survival. Respect the limits of nature, share your resources, and find strength in moderation. But perhaps the most powerful survival of the Viking spirit is resilience through calm. Life in the north still demands endurance. Long winters, isolation, and quiet. These are not conditions for the impatient. To live well here, one must learn the art of stillness. Modern Scandinavians do not rush to fill silence. They honor it. They listen to it. In that silence, the old spirit of the Longhouse still whispers, patience is power. Psychologists today note that people in northern climates have some of the lowest rates of seasonal despair, despite endless dark months. Why? Because they do not see the dark as something to fight. They see it as something to live with. They prepare for it, decorate it, name it, soften it. It is the same philosophy their ancestors practiced, transforming hardship into ritual, endurance into art. You can still see the Viking sense of fate, WYRD, in modern Scandinavian stoicism. It is the quiet understanding that life can be unpredictable, that suffering is inevitable, but dignity lies in how you face it. When the weather turns, people shrug, smile, and say, "There is no bad weather, only bad clothing." That sentence could have come straight from 1,000 years ago, and yet, beneath this endurance, there is warmth and emotional fire that mirrors the old hearth flame. Northern cultures place enormous importance on trust, equality, and social care. In Denmark, the concept of samfundssind, the spirit of community, means looking out for one another, especially in hard times. In Sweden, the daily pause for coffee, pastries, and conversation is more than a break. It is connection, ritualized. It is the same impulse that drove Viking families to gather by firelight and share stories when the night seemed endless. Even their art and music hold the same pulse. Listen to a Nordic folk song, and you can hear the echo of wind over ice, the rhythm of oars through frozen seas, the longing and beauty of survival. Modern Scandinavian literature often returns to these themes: isolation, endurance, quiet courage, because they are not just stories, they are memories carried in the blood. And yet, perhaps the most enduring trace of the Viking mindset is not found in museums or traditions, but in the way people face adversity today. When a storm hits the Arctic, when volcanoes erupt, when darkness stretches across the sky, life does not stop. Lights stay on, laughter continues, songs are sung, meals are shared. Just as their ancestors did, they endure not with rage, but with grace. That is the modern Viking lesson. Strength does not shout, it endures. In the heart of Oslo or Reykjavik, you might see children playing in the snow under the dim orange glow of streetlights. You might see a fisherman mending nets in the freezing rain, humming a song older than memory. You might see candles flickering in windows, each one a small sun against the night. And in those quiet scenes you'll realize the spirit of the North is still alive. It lives in the way they work, love, and wait for the light to return. It lives in their patience, their laughter, their simplicity. The Vikings may have left their ships behind, but they never left their wisdom, because the real voyage was never just across oceans. It was through darkness, through time, through the endless winters of the soul. And so, when you find yourself walking through your own season of cold, remember that spirit. Remember that endurance can be gentle and survival can be beautiful. The Vikings once looked at the same gray sky, felt the same biting wind, and still said, "We will make it through." They did, and so can we. The snow has melted. The rivers sing again. Smoke no longer clings to the rafters of the Longhouse, and the sun finally stays long enough to cast real shadows on the earth. But if you listen, if you close your eyes and let the wind carry its memory, you can still hear them. The crackle of fire, the murmur of voices, the breath of people who refuse to vanish into the cold. The Viking winter has ended, yet its echo remains. This is not a story of conquest or legend. It is a story of endurance, the quiet, ordinary, miraculous kind that happens when human beings choose to keep going, even when there is no reason to believe they can. For all their ships, swords, and sagas, the Vikings' greatest creation was not an empire. It was resilience. For 6 long months, they lived on the edge of the world, pressed between ice and sea. The night swallowed them whole, and yet they made the darkness their teacher. They learned that survival is not defiance of nature. It is harmony with it. They learned that faith is not blind. It is the steady flame that burns when logic goes out. They learned that strength is not the absence of fear. It is courage in the face of it. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that no one survives alone. In the frozen silence of the North, the hearth was more than fire. It was a heart. Around it, families shared warmth, food, and stories. They laughed, argued, grieved, and sang. Each person became a spark in a greater flame, keeping the cold at bay. The Longhouse was not built from wood and stone. It was built from connection. That connection, that flame, is what we carry forward. We may live in cities now, not fjords. Our storms are no longer made of snow and ice, but of noise, pressure, and uncertainty. Yet, the lessons of the North still matter. We still face our winters, the silent ones, the lonely ones, the unseen ones. And when those nights come, the Viking spirit whispers the same words across time. You have faced worse. You can face this too. The Longhouse becomes the home you build with your courage. The fire becomes the purpose that warms your days. The people beside you become your clan, because winter, in truth, was never the enemy. It was the forge. It burned away weakness and left behind clarity and knowing that life's warmth is not given, but made. Every frost-bitten field, every snow-choked valley, every night where the wind screamed like a living thing, all of it existed to teach one lesson: the light is precious, because it is earned. When the first sunrise came after months of dark, the Vikings did not take it for granted. They watched it in silence. Some wept. Others raised their hands as if to touch it. For them, that light was not just the return of the sun. It was proof that the world remembers that the earth, like the soul, may fall asleep but never dies. It is easy to romanticize them, to imagine that courage came easily to those people of iron and ash. But they were human, as we are. They feared hunger. They mourned their dead. They doubted the future. Their heroism was not that they never faltered. It was that they rose each morning and tended the fire again. Every ember was a choice. Every breath a prayer. Every shared bowl a promise. We endure. And in that endurance lies something timeless, something that has never truly left us. It is in the Scandinavian candlelight that glows through long nights. It is in the quiet determination of people who brave the Arctic dark. It is in the laughter of those who find joy even in hardship. It is in every human heart that keeps burning when the world grows cold. We inherit their legacy not through blood, but through will, through this simple decision to keep the light alive in our homes, our minds, our stories. The Vikings believed that life was a cycle, that even when the world ends in fire and frost, it begins again. That belief lives on in every person who has faced despair and chosen hope. The long winter will always return, in one form or another. But so will the dawn, and that is the legacy of light. It is not just survival. It is the defiance of despair, the faith that no matter how deep the darkness, something within us still glows. It may be small, a candle, an ember, a whisper, but it is enough. It always has been. So as we leave their world behind the smoke-filled halls, the snow-covered roofs, the frozen seas, we carry their lesson forward. The cold will come, but the fire is ours to tend. Keep your hearth alive. Keep your stories alive. Keep your light alive. Because the spirit that once kept a family warm through a -40 night is the same spirit that keeps us moving through the winters of our own making. The Vikings are gone, but their flame endures, and every act of courage, every shared warmth, every choice to believe in spring again. And when the long night comes, as it always does, may we, too, remember their whisper carried by the wind. The dark is not the end. It is where the light begins. And so, our journey through the Viking winter comes to an end. From the frozen fjords and the long, dark nights to the firelit warmth of the Longhouse and the first light of spring, we have walked beside a people who refuse to surrender to the cold. The Vikings taught us that survival is not just about strength or skill. It is about heart, about courage that does not fade, even when the world turns silent and black. Their story is not only history, it is a mirror. Because we too face winters of our own, not of ice and snow, but of doubt, fear, and change. And like them, we endure by keeping our fire alive, by helping one another, and by believing that even in the deepest dark, light always returns. So as the flames fade and the snow begins to fall once more, remember this: the long night never lasts forever. The warmth you build, the kindness you share, and the faith you keep that is your fire, protect it. Feed it. Let it burn. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time, through shadow and light. If this story touched you, leave a thought below. Share it with someone who might need a little warmth tonight. And do not forget to subscribe for more tales from history's forgotten edges. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep your light burning. This is Boring History for Sleep. Good night, and may your hearth never go cold.